those debts back in mainland China, it makes it hard to take the risk. So I think that would be the issue that have to get resolved, and that does give junkets a certain amount of protection.
Yeah, it was actually Kelvin's presentation was really fascinating, and if Kelvin says something, I mean, you've got to take it deadly seriously. I mean, he's really inside that. But the impression I got was it was a rhetorical element to it, and that is that what is the likelihood of the convertibility of the yuan in the near future? I mean, what it really was suggesting to me was just how important the role of the junket is.
Yeah, I think just to go back to the question before, the Philippines certainly is pretty much a locals market at the moment. The same is true of Japan, and if you really think about it, it's also true of Macau, because it's really catering primarily to mainland Chinese market. If you look at it in terms of has it driven tourism from outside the Greater China region, the answer is probably no. So I think it's fair to say that it's sheer volume of people which is actually going to sustain these markets, as well as obviously their economic growth over time. Now, moving on to a jurisdiction we haven't discussed, Taiwan. There was a lot of enthusiasm for Taiwan 2 years ago. It seems to have evaporated in recent times. Martin, what's the state of play?
Yeah, it's interesting because Taiwan and Japan seem to be having a competition to see which, to see who could come out last. But at this point, I'm actually kind of quietly confident that Taiwan's going to beat Japan to getting the legislation through. And there's very good reasons for this. You'll notice, folks, that there's no Taiwan session, or there wasn't a Taiwan session yesterday. And there's good reason for that. It's basically, it's been very quiet in Taiwan. There's been very little apparent movement in legislation. But the truth of the matter is that it's actually a lot closer than people might think. Up until about 6 weeks ago, the legislature was more or less on track to having a good crack at getting the legislation out in the current term. And then there was an invasion of the legislature by student protesters, who a peaceful, relatively peaceful invasion, which shut down legislative operations more or less for the entire time. And then when a solution was reached and they exited the legislative agenda was pretty drastically revised or changed, and it has delayed indefinitely consideration of the legislation. Now, at what stage was that deliberating at? Very briefly, towards the end of last year, the Executive Yuan, or the Cabinet, submitted its final version of the legislation to the legislature for consideration by the legislative committees. But at that time, confidence in the government-supported version of the bill had eroded to the point where ruling party legislators had begun to submit their own proposals to bring casinos into Taiwan proper instead of having them off the shore of Taiwan-controlled islands off the coast of China. All right? And so those of us who are here from Taiwan who follow this on a regular basis were facing, I think, 4 different drafts at one point, which were competing for attention. But in the end, after some argy-bargy, the government, the original government proposal of backing the economies of the outlying islands prevailed, and the version that is now being presented, now being debated or negotiated on, is going to be restricted to outlying islands, namely Jinmen, Mazu, and Penghu, or the 3 archipelagos. The committee debated it. They fought, as they usually do, on sensitive issues, and then they agreed to agree on a number of the clauses, and they left all the rest of the clauses to go to backroom negotiations between caucus leaders of the ruling and opposition parties, and that's the stage we're at. My confidence comes from the fact that most of the potentially contentious issues that I think would have suggested the opposition party was looking to destroy the legislation were not taken up. What the opposition has done is make some rather outrageous proposals, including super high tax levels that would kill any industry altogether, or that any inklings of an industry would not come about. I have a feeling, however, that those kinds of proposals that the opposition party put forward are simply bargaining chips to get other more sensible bits of legislation through, including insisting on an independent regulator. which is, as my Taiwan friends will know, is a bugbear of mine. It's something they need desperately to give the public more confidence in the process. But at this point, we are waiting for the negotiations between the parties to resume and to put the legislation into the third reading on the legislative floor. I'm confident that it will pass because there is not a majority of people who oppose the bill as it stands.
Yes, question.
As we get closer to the point where the existing
Sorry,
concessionaires...
could you just wait for the mic, please? Thanks.
Thank you. As we get closer to the point where the existing 6 concessionaires here in Macau are up for relicensing, what insight could the panel provide as to whether that is likely to be a rather routine relicensing process or a complex process in light of regional events and what we know about China and Macau today?
Thank you. Andrew?
I mean, I would say that I for sure don't know the answer to the question, but listening to the various gaming companies and people in the marketplace, it seems that it will be relatively routine. They have said that they won't allow another licensee into the market, so they've given us a little bit of clarity there. You know, and so then it becomes a question of the length of the new license and whether or not there's a tax change, which it looks like there won't be, and what the one-time payment associated with that license would be. So I think we're looking at the size of the one-time payment and the length of the license, not whether or not there'll be additional players or a tax rate change.
I mean, I agree. It's just it's really too early to speculate convincingly on what will happen. I would, in addition to the points that Andrew made, I would simply add something that's perhaps a little bit more political, and that is, although the basic law, I think, forbids intervention in many of Macau's governmental processes by Beijing, with the exception of defense and foreign affairs, I believe,